Welcome back, friends, and today we're reading an original novel, Piggy, Traitor by Terrance Crawford, Book 5, Chapter 4, Part 1. Silence, it seemed, suited the group just fine. They had spent the last several months together, hearing one another's stories, learning one another's habits and tales. It wasn't necessary for them to say much of anything to one another anymore, outside of pointing out a fruit tree or any infected creature wandering a bit too close to the group. As the newcomer, Dio took his cue and was quiet as well. Dio had been traveling by himself all this way, and he'd grown used to the sound of silence. Clang, Dio, shaken from his reverie by the sound of metal reverberating as Foley leapt up and slammed the sign that marked entrance to Lucella city limits. Dio had been born and raised in the suburbs of the city, but even he knew that what was once a sprawling metropolis was now a sprawling ruin, overrun with mindless monsters who wanted nothing more than to devour you for a mid-morning snack. The city of Lucella had been largely abandoned for the better part of a year. Cars and trucks littered the side of the road, waiting for owners who, for some reason or another, would never return. Though it had only been a couple of months, cars had begun to rust, coats of paint peeling and chipped. Even in the gentle afternoon wind, some of the cars' headlights were still on, projecting faint beams of light into the distance ahead. Others, Gil surmised, had burned out ages ago. The yellow lines of paint that marked the road seemed far too fade for a city that hadn't faced traffic in months. They were certainly not for lacking of trying. Every stoplight they had come across since they had entered the city had been on the fritz, slowly cycling through three blinking colors. The lamppost whose job it was to illuminate the city's streets seemed to have called in sick to work. The moon had not yet even settled in the sky, and it was clear that the flickering bulbs that lined the street were not up to the task. It seemed that half the buildings in the city had been peppered with graffiti indecipherable tags and overlapping swirls of color, covering the facade of what looked like every other building. Each piece of scrawled artwork told a tale. Dale even recognized some of the symbols sprayed across the building from his trek across town. The crocodiles were easy to pin. There wasn't a survivor around who had not heard the rumor of the crocodiles who lived in the sewers. It had been repeated so often as an urban legend, Diego couldn't be sure that it wasn't true. Silver paw prints that was seeing everywhere he was less sure of, but he assumed that they meant something to someone. As the sun began to descend its descent over the skyline of the city, the wind began to pick up, kicking up bits of dust and debris with it. The street sweeping trucks that kept the city clean had not been by in weeks, leaving the streets caked with a thin layer of dirt. Old newspapers flew by, but all their headlines are about the same thing, no matter their date. There had only been one thing newsworthy the last few weeks before the city had been left largely abandoned, and it was the same thing that they were contending with now. Hundreds of shards of glass lay strewn across the ground, courtesy of the groups of looters who had made it their mission to strip the city dry on their way out. Homes, businesses, even the cars on the street had been nearly stripped bare. The group's destination lay directly ahead now, a place called Ellie Enterprises, the Lucella Grand Plaza Hotel. Directly across the street was likely overrun with exactly the kind of company that the party was trying to avoid. Not only that, a $4 candy from the mini fridge was outrageous. The safe place was still at least a day's trek ahead, and when the sun went down, the group would need a place to rest. They had attempted to set up camp outside before, but it was far too dangerous than it was worth. Hopefully, Ellie Enterprises would be their final stop before they reached this sanctum that was a safe place. Hopefully, but Dio had not been afforded the luxury of hope in a long time. Ellie Enterprises was a two-story building comprised of light gray bricks and massive windows that looked out over the city in every direction. If the sextet had not been sure that they were in the right place, the massive sign, steel bars 10 feet high, that read Ellie Enterprises would have certainly tipped them off. Diego did not want to know what had come onto the anonymous Ellie, but he had a few guesses. The cars that sat in the building parking lot had suffered the same fate as the rest of the cars in the city. Abandoned, gutted, and aged much quicker than they should. Diego could relate. The building security was intense and still active, which explained why the infected seemingly had such trouble getting inside. A series of key cards were needed to progress. They were color-coded and locked inside safes that would need to be opened by the other key cards. Terry had another idea. Terry punched through the keycard scanner. Doors whisked open. Fully sauntered through the doors, unbothered, and making a beeline for the refrigerator. He found what he was looking for immediately, even before the virus. Ellie had been known as a place to grab something to eat and drink. Fully cracked open a case of water, grabbing a bottle and pouring it down his throat in one uninterrupted gulp. The others made their way to join him as Terry forced the door closed behind them. Dave grabbed a bottle of water and cracked it, taking a hefty sip for himself. The chill of the water made its way up his spine to tickle the base of his brain. Clean water was never a guarantee in the wilds of Villia, and cold water was worth its weight in gold. The water flowed past his lips, working its way down a parched throat. The others did the same, and for a few moments only the sound of smacking lips and heavy breaths filled the air. It was almost too good to be true. Between the six of them, they quickly recovered the 2 floors of Ellie's enterprises, checking every room for any sign of the infected creatures. Miraculously, each and every room of the building was free of the things. Ellie would have to thank its advanced security system for keeping the beast at bay. The party threw their collective belongings in a pile and went to search for a meal. There was nothing like a long day's march through an infested wasteland to work up an appetite. The group devoured the food that they came across in Ellie's refrigerator, tearing through a week's worth of meals over the course of a few hours. Even Danny managed to choke down a few bites despite his claims to not feel that hungry. It was a strange feeling for the party to be in such a high spirit, but why shouldn't they be? They were well fed and safe for the night. It was rare enough to find one of those things. Stumbling upon both was more than enough cause for elation, as often was the case that bellies were full. Eyelids began to droop. Diego was fading in and out of consciousness, his stomach satisfied and his legs aching from the day's journey. Sun had set and the moon was high overhead in the sky. The only real source of light outside was low wattage bulbs inside Ellie's. Of course, the city maintained just enough of the electric buzz to keep the starlight at bay. Though the thick glass windows of Ellie's enterprises, they could see the droves of infected creatures roaming the streets of Lucella. Glowing red eyes floated in the distance, and then, in the not-so-distance, one of the creatures pressed its face against the glass window, the way a curious child might at an aquarium. Deprived of the opportunity to play with his food, the creature soon grew bored and wandered off to join another coterie of the bloodthirsty beasts. It was a strange thing to see the infected up close. They were all bristle and bluster, with a dash of inside. Still, some of them wore tropical shirts, while others wore lab coats. They all undoubtedly had lived at Sam Point. Dale would take that as his cue to retire for the evening. It had seen enough for one day. While the architect of Ellie Enterprises had not had the foresight to include bedrooms in its design, there was a glass room at the end of the hall with a massive conference table that Dio had been eyeing since they first walked in through the place. Washing his face and brushing his teeth in the nearby bathroom, Dio stashed his toothbrush and towel in his backpack, then stuck his backpack beneath his head. Admittedly, neck support was not something that he had prioritized during his time in Avalia. It didn't seem to matter because minutes later, Dio was drifting off to sleep. Dio found himself surrounded by an eerie blackness, a deep, deep darkness that seemed to swallow everything that it touched. A wave of exasperation crashed over him, even in his sleep. He had been here once before. This was not the first time that he had dreamed this dream. As if on cue, the entity burst forward from the shadows, already disfigured and distorted. Infected creatures dripped from him like raindrops off a coat, splashing onto the ground and was marching toward a defenseless Diego. "Help me, Diego," the entity's voice echoed in Diego's head, even though its toothy mouth never moved. Again, Diego refused. The entity came prepared with a rebuttal. "I can offer you everything." Wispy illusions formed at the entity's feet. Smoke, that formed into whatever Dio desired. They cycled through shape after shape, eventually settling on the form of Dio's parents, happy and healthy. Dio knew it was a trick, and still, when they reached out to touch him, he extended his arm as well. Their fingers was about to grasp when a high-pitched sound began to drag him back to consciousness. The scream rang out through the night. At first, Dio had thought it was part of his dream, but it quickly became clear that this was not the case. The entity swiped at him fiercely with pointed claws as Dio ascended out of its grasp. Half awakened somewhere between the realms of sleep and waking, Dio fumbled around for a shovel groggily. He forced his eyelids open, his blurry eyes trying their best to quickly adjust to their darkness. There were flashes of movement out the corner of his field of vision. Dio balled his fists and rubbed his eyes, his vision finally coming into focus. He blinked several times rapidly. He pushed himself off the conference table, his legs still a little wobbly as consciousness caught up with him. It was though he needed time to medicate and stretch, maybe with a hot and creamy mocha latte to start his morning, but he had been in the deepest state of his sleep cycle just seconds ago. The commotion in the hallway did nothing to explain what had just happened or where the scream had come from. Naturally, the shriek has woken everyone and drawn them from their chambers. Everyone was muttering under their breaths, and all of them seemed to be just as confused as Dio was. Dio stiffly yawned, covering his mouth with the side of his elbow. Terry flicked on the light switch, causing everyone gathered to groan and wince as their eyes adjusted to the altogether unimpressive overhead lighting, judging by the moonlight streaming in through the oversized window. It was still the middle of the night. Her eyes swarmed in the near distance like so many fireflies on a warm summer night. "What's going on?" Rhea queried, asking the question that was on everyone's mind. Dio cocked his head, waiting for a sarcastic response from Foley. But none came. It wasn't like Foley to miss a chance to interject his unique brand of conversational patter. Instead, Dio agreed with nothing but silence as seemingly everyone waited for someone else to answer the question. Looking around, Dio posed another inquiry. "Wait, where's Foley?" The party searched among themselves in disbelief, but it quickly became clear that Foley was nowhere to be found. "Hey, look at that!" Lucy exclaimed, pointing down the hallway. The quintet all gathered to look at this. Lucy was found. They all wished they hadn't. Etched into the floor and leading down the stairs was a fresh pair of claw marks, dragging across the ground. Not the kind that infected often left behind when they were trying to get inside. More like the kind that someone left behind when they were trying to stay inside. It seemed that the mystery of Foley's disappearance had been solved as quickly as it had been posed. Dragging off into the night, it was a grim fate even at the end of the world. So, friends, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Follow us on social media, Funkyplaybrothers, Funkyplaybrothers, and please remember to subscribe to our YouTube. Thank you for watching. Bye.